How do you guys feel about the Department of Education being dismantled by Trump? Story 1. As someone who works in education and is in California, I am only too worried. California has already established that it will pick up the slack that the Department of Education releases. Story 2. What this changes is it allows states to spend education dollars without federal oversight. This feeds into the conservative rights plans to fund private schools with public dollars, etc. This doesn't save money, it just eliminates oversight, which is the whole point of many of the agencies Trump is dismantling. Story 3. Extremely worried. I work in special education and this is going to affect my students and my job more than anything. My students will lose things listed in their IEPs. If they need new equipment, they won't be able to get it. They are given free breakfast and lunches while they are at school, and these families rely on it. Story 4. Definitely concerned. The states already have a ton of control over things like curriculum. What they don't have is the funding for IEPs and 504s. That's federal funding, and I am incredibly concerned about the kids who this has the potential to impact. I agree that our public school system needs a rework, but am not sure if completely getting rid of the Department of Ed is a good starting point. Story 5. My kid will be fine. I live in a blue state and have the means to provide a good education for her. However, being a somewhat decent human being, I'm furious on behalf of other kids. And it's easy to say, oh, the red states are just getting what they voted for, but this will hurt so many innocent kids and people in all states who did not vote for it and just happen to live where they live. I'm also pissed because you know he's going to do away with public loan forgiveness even for people who, like me, are only a few years away from forgiveness and may have taken lower-paying jobs because of the promise of that forgiveness. Story 6. This would depend on what half of the voting public you are asking, but from a non-political perspective, the purpose of its inception was to provide opportunity and combat a lot of the things this presidency is rolling the calendar back on. Families will move states to provide an education and opportunities they feel are adequate for their children, and thus by proxy, roll the U.S. back to the early 60s. Story 7. I feel sorry for all of the children in red states that are about to lose out big time. Good teachers are already leaving these areas in droves since pay matches the low test scores. Story 8. Considering it was one of the stated objectives of Project 2025, I am not at all surprised. Those folks told me he would never do it though. I imagine they might be a little surprised. Story 9. We're about to find out how stupid the South really is. LOL. Without help from Big Daddy, those southern states are really gonna struggle teaching people. Story 10. Almost all schools get funded through property taxes at the county level in their state. But the Department of Education is supposed to guarantee student civil rights and make sure they get accommodations if needed. Story 11. I deeply do not care. He is kind of right about our school system being bad. Is this the way to make it better? No idea. Maybe ask Switzerland and Norway ECT what they are doing. Story 12. However anyone feels about a department, a single man should not unilaterally be able to shutter an entire department, or reduce it so drastically without Congress. The legislature has already allocated a certain amount of money to the organization. What is going to happen to the money that's supposed to go to it? Story 13. I'm going to say something unpopular here, but as a red state that has had notable education improvements like a 10 increase in graduation rates over the past 10 to 15 years, we have primarily attributed our improvement to our state policies and local state-funded grants. We had a slight dip after COVID, but the progress over 15 years is legit. I had a friend who studied this at a well-known nonpartisan think tank. Local policy, economy, and family had far more impact on a child's education than federal policy. You have to want the improvement at the most local of levels for it to even matter. Story 14. I'm not extremely educated on it. However, it's not like test scores have gone up significantly since the Department of Education was formed. All he's doing is returning it back to the states. Again, I'm not fully educated on this, but if it's federally funded, and you have some states doing extremely well, and some states doing extremely poorly, shouldn't there be a more even curve? Story 15. I know exactly what is going to happen. 1. Standards and expectations will go down. 2. The average American will be less educated and easier to influence or manipulate. 3. Many jobs won't find the right candidates and skills will be needed for the economy to continue. 4. Immigration will increase. 5. With more immigrants getting the best jobs that require skilled workers, the average American will get frustrated. 6. More Americans will shift to right-wing ideas and vote Republican. 7. And so on, and it will get even worse. Story 16. Has education gotten any better since the establishment of NEA? Nope, much worse. Take responsibility back to the states where it's much easier to hold ruling bodies accountable. Cut the waste, fraud, abuse, and inefficiency. Story 17. I'm of two minds. My initial reaction is that it is appalling, but I also look around to my fellow Americans and often think our education system is failing us. There are tons of Americans seriously lacking in critical thinking skills. Now, there's still a question of complete dissolution versus guided reform, which is the right approach. I'm honestly not sure. I lean more towards reform because I fear that dissolution could be a recipe for disaster. For what it's worth, my sisters are both in education, so I spoke with them about this. They've had issues with the way funding is appropriated and how test scores drive everything. They believe the current way things are done is not always the most efficient and not always best for the kids. I think they're relatively okay with dissolving ED, assuming that those funding allocations, one of the primary purposes of ED, get handled appropriately by individual states. With funding allocation being one of ED's primary responsibilities, some of their colleagues view the department as an unnecessary middleman that doesn't always understand what's happening on the ground floor. My fear is that not all states will handle this funding appropriately. Some will take funds away from kids who need them, like SPED. Ultimately, I think dissolution of ED will create even more disparity of education between certain communities and classes of people. There will absolutely be areas that suffer more than others from this. Voting for the right local politicians becomes even more important. Story 18. I think they have ulterior motives. When you dismantle something that you have no legal right to dismantle, offer no replacement, and don't go through the legal process with Congress, it's hard to imagine this is being done in good faith. Story 19. I can't really speak to that, but I am extremely involved in the school district that my children attend. I sat on the board from 2018 to 2021, and during that time, me and the other board members went to war against the administrative staff and cost. In our area, we reduced the admin costs by nearly 60 and started paying teachers more. The teachers in our district make on average 40 more than the teachers in other districts, and since 2019 when we got everything passed, our district is exemplary in outcomes. We have a higher teacher-to-student ratio, and this year we are shooting for highest college acceptance rate nationwide. I say all that to say that education administrative spending is out of control. Somewhere along the way, education figured the way to succeed is to hire ultra-qualified PhDs at every level to train teachers, but we found out that they are so disconnected from the issues in the classroom, their advice is useless. I am imagining that the DOE is likely just billions of dollars on bloat if that is what our local school district is, and at some point you have to just call it a failed experiment and cut the loss. I am not losing sleep over a few hundred PhDs making $600K a year losing their remote jobs. Story 20. I'd be okay with it if they actually had a plan to replace it with something better. I have an illiterate friend, born and raised in America, made it all the way through public school and high school. I can't even pretend to look at a collection of letters and not be able to read it. Story 21. I'm in Alabama. I'm just waiting for the ton of cutbacks that will take place. 1 in 6 education dollars in this state comes from the federal government. I just can't believe these dumb voted for this guy. Story 22. I pray the courts do their job and block this obviously unconstitutional bullshit. BC, if it goes through, it will completely and irrevocably destroy this nation. It will be the nail in our coffin. There is no returning from this. Story 23. Since the inception, the Department of Education has completely failed American students. We used to be first in education around the world, now we are deep in the 20s. Our students can't read, they can't do math, they don't know history, science or biology. They have groomed our children to become activists and not critical thinkers. It has become a body of administration as almost 70% of its entire workforce are not teachers but taxpayer-funded paper pushers. The money they always beg for goes to the top-level administrators and not the amazing teachers that deserve it. The whole system has been defiled and no real learning is getting accomplished. Story 24. Unless you are like genuinely of below-average intellect and are likely some degree of illiterate to the point you can't comprehend what this will cause, this is a bad thing. Part of the reason the department was founded was because southern state educations were falling behind so severely that their economies were experiencing severe issues with finding educated labor. No one from states with functioning educational systems were willing to move to states with double-digit illiteracy rates, and it meant that Southern Americans were basically not considered a serious or worthwhile workforce. Companies were pulling out because if your job required a workforce that could read and write, other states were better options. Seriously, the quality of education in the 70s between wealthy states and poor states was astronomical. We're going to rapidly fall back into that, and the emerging workforce will once again be seen as unfit for anything more complicated than service labor or manual labor. These states will experience enormous economic losses and will become even more belligerent. Educated and wealthy families will also flee for wealthier states to give their children a better education. It will result in immense brain drain, economic loss for red, southern states and drive money into blue and wealthy states. It won't actually hurt the people they want to hurt, but by the time the regular voter realizes that it will be too late. Story 25. As a teacher, and as someone who didn't vote for Cheeto Stalin, I think it's probably going to be the thing that turns people against him. When parents have to pay more fees, when after-school sports and activities have to be cancelled, when they have to start packing breakfast and lunch for their kids, when there is no guidance or mental health counselors, when their kids' IEP or 504 is ignored, when their kids are in classes with 40 students, when their kids get into a great school but there are no loans, when graduate schools can only accept students who can afford to pay in cash, parents are going to see how many services the DO helps districts pay for. Personally, I hope it puts the responsibility of parenting back on parents. I'm tired of having to parent students whose parents are too busy on TikTok to do their job. Schools do too much right now. Story 26. I moved from a state with great public schools to Louisiana. If you want your kid to get a half-decent education here, you need to shell out $5 to $17K per year in tuition for private school. Most of them are religious schools too, which is ironic coming from the party that cries about public schools and universities indoctrinating children. I worry that this is what education will look like without DOE. People with means will be able to afford a good education that prepares them for college and profitable careers. Everyone else will either have to get lucky or become just literate enough to be useful in the workforce without being able to advance into a sustainable career. Story 27. They're going to abolish something that costs 300 billion years, yet my federal taxes won't decrease, and my state taxes will inevitably increase to fund our own system entirely by ourselves. Poor states are about to find out how much New York, Florida, Texas, California carry the country. Story 28. It's bad. I live in a blue state that puts more into the Department of Education in dollars than we get out. However, we still get a lot more value out of it than it costs us. The administration, setting of education policies and standards, research and data collection are all things that we're going to have to do by ourselves now. Instead of all the states pooling our money together and doing these tasks once, now each state will have to do it for themselves. Much of the research just won't be done by anyone, or will be done inconsistently by state. It makes the whole system less efficient, which is the point. The Republicans want to destroy the public sector, so they can complain about how badly it works, and then privatize it so they can make more money off of it. It's not about giving states more freedom, it's about reducing efficiency in the public sector. Story 29. I live in Montana, the state that receives some of the most federal funding for education for our budget. If we get it cut, we are absolutely undeniably. Our own state cannot and frankly will not pick up any slack, and we may see genuinely most of our already underfunded and understaffed schools either close or our districts merge within the coming years, which will screw over our very rural state. 21 of all our schools receive federal funding, and we have the highest federal funding overall per pupil, 3K. Some cities and towns may do better due to tourism funds, but still would be losing most our funding. On top of the education, our state is also the state that receives the most imports from Mexico and obviously Canada 93, so with added tariffs our economy is going to crumble much worse than other states. That's an educational collapse paired with an economic collapse and paired with a mental health epidemic. MT has the highest suicide rates. Already things ain't looking too good for the future of my state. Story 30. Seems odd that some people think the U.S. Department of Education is a big impact department. Every single state has its own state-level Department of Education that is far more involved in what's really going on in the classroom. Also, the U.S. Department of Edu was mainly set up to collect data from the states and spread best practices across the nation, but it was founded before the WWW Internet around 1979-1980, and now with ubiquitous Internet, data warehousing, analytics, voice CONF software and so on. The states don't need a centralized bottleneck to disseminate best practices. They can just quickly go about doing it themselves rather than waiting on a central bureaucracy to get around to it. Education in America is straight in the toilet right now. Something had to change, and apparently special program funding will still flow to the states and isn't being cut. The cuts are just to the U.S. Department of Edu itself. Story 31. It should have never been created. We all suffer when our tax dollars are laundered through multiple layers of abstraction with everyone helping themselves to a cut along the way. Better to let the states keep their money and oversee education closer to home. Story 32. I mean, it's going so well in most places. Honestly, we just left an A-rated school and it was a joke, terrible teacher, just an affluent town. We moved to a rural farm town with lots of transient families and the school is outstanding. Teachers are engaged and do well. I don't know what the problem is, but it doesn't seem like federal oversight is doing anything about it. Story 33. Let me share my balanced, non-typical of left-wing Reddit take. Conservatives have wanted this for ages, arguing that the department is a bloated mess $238 billion budget that hasn't actually improved student outcomes. Their take, the U.S. spends more per student than most countries, yet our test scores are still mid. So why not let states handle it instead of drowning in D.C. bureaucracy? His executive order keeps some big-ticket stuff: Pell Grants, Title I for low-income schools, special ed funding, but shifts them to other agencies. Supporters say this is a win for local control, cutting federal woke policies like DEI programs and gender curriculum. But hey, race the problem. Critics, including Dems and education advocates, say this could absolutely screw over low-income kids, students with disabilities, and rural schools, especially in red states that rely on federal funding. The DOE doesn't control what schools teach at state level, but it does enforce civil rights laws and handle $1.6 trillion in student loans. So if it disappears, who takes over? No one really knows. Legally, Trump can't just snap his fingers and delete the department. Congress has to vote on it, and with the Senate so divided, getting 60 votes past a filibuster is unlikely. Also, lawsuits are already flying in hot. Democratic AGs filed one last week, calling the cuts unconstitutional. The workforce is already shrinking fast, down from 4,100 to 2,100 since January, so the slow dismantling is happening, but a full shutdown, that's a whole different beast. So yeah, this is a wild experiment. Could make things leaner if states handle it well, or could leave huge gaps that hit the most vulnerable students hardest. No one really knows how this plays out. Feels like we're about to A/B test the entire U.S. education system. Story 34. All those MAGA parents in red states with special needs kids are going to be in for a shock when their school no longer has funding for special education. Story 35. Trump needs more idiots to support his policies. When will people realize this is all about tax cuts for the rich? Nothing else. He just wants to cut money from the budget so that he can lower taxes for his friends. Story 36. We have been rock bottom on education for decades. People are graduating high school who do not know how to read or write. The dude has failed miserable, and the government has just been blowing money to people who have done nothing to improve or fix it, so I really can't feel bad that it's going away. Story 37. I am thrilled that a micromanaging, control freak, out-of-touch, power-mad organization is going to lose all its influence over American kids and parents. Billions of dollars spent in 40 years wasted pursuing policies that have left us with nearly 2 generations of illiterate graduates who have had their hope and positive outlook destroyed. The union bosses have benefited mightily, and people like Randy Weingarten owe their allegiance to the bureaucracy, not the kids. The people who will be hurt by the dismantling of the Department of Ed are not the kids but the adults that leech off from the funding intended to help children. Their rallying cry is "do it for the children." That's a big fat lie, by the way. I'm not a Russian bot but rather an Irish realist. Story 38. I hate it. There are so many things fundamentally wrong with education in America as a whole, but the system needed to be fixed, not nuked. I just foresee public funds being given to private schools because that's where the Republican voters move their students so they don't have to learn science. Story 39. On the one hand, K-12 education in US is a joke, big joke period. Source: I lived and worked in China and Japan for years. On the other hand, I'm not sure getting rid of DE is the best way to solve the problem. Since it has happened and we can only move forward, I hope it opens the door for each state to try new things. Whatever we try, as long as it is different from before, it can't be worse. Story 40. The GOP knows that the more educated someone is, the less likely they are to vote GOP, so they are trying to make sure people stay too stupid to know better. I guarantee all the GOP states will tank their education quality even worse now. Story 41. States will have to pick up the slack. My state of SC gets billions in for education. When classes get bigger, buses get older and kids have to share workbooks, MAGA will still blame Biden. Story 42. I live in a very blue city in a very red state. Our education system is shameful. The last thing we need to do is give more power to the psychopaths running the state. Story 43. This is a relatively new department. 1979. I was too young to remember the state of education at that time, but I would say with our rankings in the country today, doing something is in order. Story 44. The Department of Education is clearly failing, so it's time to try a different approach, i.e., turning things back over to the state and local boards. Story 45. We made a change at my work about our public infrastructure. 13 of the people coming to our company couldn't use us. We found out they couldn't read, could barely read, and couldn't understand what they could read. If we went countrywide homeschooling, it would probably be better than what we have now. Story 46. Republicans have been wanting to do this for decades. They want complete privatization of education, free from government oversight that enforces silly things like civil rights, private education that can teach indoctrinate children to become good little capitalist Christian nationalists. This is also why they run for local school boards. This is also why they want to choose textbooks, or more importantly, choose which textbooks to remove. This isn't about government efficiency or money, it's a function of the culture war. Story 47. Let the Christian indoctrination begin. The Red Hats MAGA can now shove their religious BS down children's throats. Little girls, be good and let men molest you and ask God to forgive you. Little boys, take what you want, you are entitled to it as the superior being. Man, God's love is good. Let's all have a meal together and praise Jesus. Story 48. Hate it. Thanks for asking. I feel betrayed by this country for being forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance in school. With liberty and justice for all, there is no justice for all. There is no liberty for all. Turns out the whole thing has been a sham for many years now. I'm fine with it. The US spends crazy taxpayer money into it, and our education system is not improving. It basically funds woke agendas and pays out a ton in overhead and management costs. Not much gets all the way down and affects the students. Story 49. The biggest reason why I managed to graduate from school was because I had an IEP. If I didn't have that, I would have been completely. And now Trump is taking away that support I had from millions of kids who needed the same support I did. Him and this, he's going to ruin millions of children's lives. I'm not an American, but it looks part of the movement to reduce federal influence and move it back to the individual states, which was a big part of Trump's manifesto. Story 50. The same way I feel about so much Trump stuff. The Department of Education sucks. It clearly has huge problems, and the people are not getting the desired result. I'm fine with dismantling it as, like many things, I'm not sure it's savable or worth saving. But that said, does that mean I want Trump and Musk being the ones doing the dismantling? Does that mean I want every state being in charge of its own miseducation? EFF no. Everything is too politicized, right and left. Some leftist states are going to go full ridiculous, and some rightist states are going to go even more so. Story 51. Yet another reminder of why I've elected to be on Team Child Free. Kids are going to suffer due to this feckless sham of an administration. Unsurprisingly, they always do at the hands of pro-lifers. What the right fails and refuses to understand is stuff like education and abortion needs to be broadly protected and accessible regardless of where constituents reside. They're effectively further dumbing down the communities that voted for them, which maybe was the plan all along. Story 52. Republicans have advocated for its demise for the past 40 years. Now they have their wish. Say goodbye to 13.6 of funding for public K-12 education and hello to higher property taxes. Say goodbye to Title I, which describes federal allocation of supplemental financial assistance to school district schools with a high percentage of children from low-income families. Say hello to making it difficult for non-English speaking students gain equal access to education. Say goodbye to the single largest source of loans for college students. Data collection and research will grind to a halt. The end to improving results for infants, toddlers, children and youth with disabilities ages birth through 21 by providing leadership and financial assistance. OSCP symbolically, it signals the end of the federal government's commitment to public education. Anyone for it is anti-education, anti-child, anti-special needs children, anti-student loans. Oh yeah, anti the 4,200 employees who work for that department. Quote source. Story 53. Not too worried in the short term. I suspect the functional states red as blue states will barely feel it at the school level, and we will likely see an injunction slapped on the whole thing in the coming days, given the executive's lack of authority to dismantle a congressionally approved department. That being said, in the long run, definitely causing some existential dread. Fascists don't like taking no for an answer and will keep trying to dismantle and harm public education and its standards. Additionally, the fascists will hide behind "we're just sending it back to the states," as if that won't immediately harm quality of education in rural conservative areas. Plus, we have been through this song and dance before. They are lying when they say they just want to send it back to the states. It is send it to the states until there are states not teaching or operating as they like, then they will come for us. Story 54. I'm learning that it doesn't matter how big of a failure any government department is, if it had a nice sounding name, people will back it. We were one in the world before the DOE and now we're like 25th, while paying the most per student. Story 55. It's not a risk I would take, but I do think it is a genuine attempt at solving a problem and not some attempt to dumb down Americans or whatever. The stats he spouts, while they are exaggerated, they are also representative of the truth, and they are also all worse than before the department was started. Story 56. I'm autistic, luckily an adult who does not need special ed, but lots of kids do need programs, and Trump wants to put special needs under the purview of RFK Jr., who refers to autistic people as a holocaust and wants to put people like me on wellness farms, i.e., labor camps. Deeply disturbing. Story 57. The education in this country is already terrible. We should be assessing inefficiencies and flaws, finding root causes, and implementing improvements rather than just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's how I feel about all of this weird dismantling though. Yes, it takes time to do, and yes, it should have already been done years ago and on an ongoing basis really, because business agility is something all organizations should strive toward, whether for profit, non-profit, or government, but the longer-term ROI would be better. To me, dismantling the dough is like, well, this medicine didn't work to make me better. Guess all medicine is a scam. Story 58. I mean, the whole point is giving it back to the states. That being said, good luck Bible belters. No school for you, just the word of God and His will. Story 59. The single greatest problem with the concept of dismantling the ED is all of the idiots who think that it's suddenly going to become up to states what the curriculum is. It's always been up to the states. The Department of Education only exists to provide funding. All determinations about what is taught in the classrooms happen at the state level, or at the local board level. So aside from the fact that the states already determine the curriculum, and that won't change, the notion that suddenly state education departments are going to have access to more money is pure delusion. This decision has nothing to do with improving anything in true conservative fashion. They are doing this to make public education so unreasonably ineffective that they can sell the idea of private education funded with taxpayer dollars. Story 60. It's crazy. The dough intakes $268 billion a year and takes some, but the mass majority goes to the states. The reason they want to control it is because they want that money. I don't get how people don't see it. They want to stick their hands in the pots they've never been allowed to. They want to steal it and leave us poor so they can run the world the way they want. Get race out of equation because all of us are going to be slaves. They're turning the government into something only they will have power over. We will be going back to a king essentially. They cut funding for Social Security to kill us in our old age. They take away the funding for public schools so we can't get the education we need to be put in positions against them. This is just a drop in the bucket of things to come if he's not stopped. Story 61. The real purpose of Trump's move is to redirect the money distributed by the DOE to vouchers. His BS about returning control of education back to the states ignores the fact that states, not the federal government, controls the curriculum for its students. After the DOE is gone and its monetary function altered, the states will receive block grants that it can use on education. If you live in a red state, it's likely the state government will pass out vouchers for parents used to send their children to a charter school. What goes unsaid is that these vouchers will not cover a child's cost for each session and families will have to pay out of their own pockets. Some red states are sure to disband public schools as a strategy to fund these charter schools. The ultimate goal of this movement is to force the federal government into providing funding to religious schools. By closing the DOE, the states will be able to divert federal grant money to religiously affiliated charter schools, and the federal government can claim it had no part in the state's choices for funding. Story 62. We're going to have a generation of children taught that the Earth is 5,000 years old, dinosaurs didn't exist, the world is flat and evolution is a lie, idiocracy will be real. Story 63. As a Canadian, and this is going to sound bad, I really think these stupid Americans who voted him in deserve and need to feel every bit of pain this president causes. Same goes for the tens of millions that did not vote. For those that voted Democrat, I feel empathy for. But for the world's biggest superpower to continuously threaten our sovereignty on a daily basis, this really sucks. This man is not a world leader. This man still doesn't understand how tariffs work. This man let an autistic billionaire, known to have a lack of empathy, dismantle the key government services that protect the vulnerable. There are consequences for putting someone like this in power, and it's to be felt so that history does not repeat itself again. Story 64. I have a lot of concerns about how all this is being done. It's like using a chainsaw to fix an ingrown toenail, lots of knee actions with no forethought. Story 65. Speaking as a teacher, the federal DOE has actually been pretty obsolete since every state and territory I believe have their own departments of education. In all honesty, giving the power to the states is probably better. Most of the job of the federal DOE can be taken care of by the DOJ and the Department of the Treasury. The people who are upset by this are mostly partisan people, union fanatics, and people who don't realize how little the DOE does at a federal level. I don't see this changing much in my state. In fact, we may actually see a massive positive change to prior to No Child and Race. No offense, but those two programs did not help education. Story 66. Exec orders are not law and he cannot dismantle DOE by exec order. It's infuriating this isn't effectively communicated through basic journalistic standards. Story 67. Removing the DOE is just an excuse to lower educational standards, reintroduce segregation, feed the rich at the expense of the poor, to shoehorn in absurd religious instruction, as well as to remove non-white and non-male historical contributions in school curricula. It's easier to make reprehensible changes when the looming eye of human decency isn't viewed at the state level. Story 68. It feels like a strategic move to keep our population, and namely those in red states who voted for him, uneducated, lower education and worse critical thinking skills, create a wider class disparity by making it easier to lie to the working class and persuade them that good decisions are being made. Meanwhile, they don't understand them and won't ask questions or challenge them, ultimately keeping the worst people in power. Story 69. Sad and angry. My 18-year-old is graduating. He had an IEP for his entire education. We fought hard for that IEP, but we also worked with his team. It helped so much. I don't know how disabled kids will fare without the Department of Education to oversee IDEA implementation. Story 70. Trump is the GOP are cowards. I predict that Trump will declare martial law before the midterm elections so he can pause those elections. He is leveraging his power to never leave the White House. I keep being told Americans will never stand for that. Look at what they've stood for already. Trump is a fascist dictator, and Americans think it's not a big deal. Story 71. Dismantling the Department of Education sounds like giving states more freedom. But if you look at the Nordic countries, some of the best education systems in the world, they do the opposite. They have strong national policies that ensure equal funding, high teaching standards, and free education for everyone. The U.S. already has huge gaps between rich and poor states when it comes to education. Removing federal oversight wouldn't make things better, it would make inequality even worse. Story 72. Good. The federal Department of Education has been up education for far too long. Everything in public schools has been teached to the test with this one-size-fits-all education system that is completely failing the majority of children. Not all people have the same learning styles, abilities, or interests. My state has been experimenting with all sorts of alternative education options, charter schools, school choice, education freedom accounts, etc. I'm jealous of the opportunities the kids in my state have today that weren't available to me as a kid. Federal Department of Education gets in the way of a lot of this. It really doesn't do anything but order state and local education boards around. We need more alternatives, more education, more choice, so kids can get the education that suits them best. Story 73. I saw a TikTok. A father asked his high school kid what a certain word says. It was something easy like the word definitely, and the kid couldn't pronounce it or read it. If you look at test scores in the world, America isn't as high as people think we are. According to World Population Review, America is ranked 31 in the world. Education rankings by country 2025. With how much money we spend on the Department of Education, we should be higher. This isn't a left or right issue, it's a greed issue within our government. Story 74. I think our current education system has been broken and failing both our youth and our school teachers for many years. I am hopeful and excited for total reform. People are acting like we're about to just not have schools anymore or something. It's weird.